Hello and good evening, everyone. Only Positivity here. I do not have my coffee with me since it's the evening. I don't want to be up all night, but ready to kick off the ninth podcast on this playlist that I'm looking to launch. It's called Elevated Thoughts. But before diving into the book, and we have a new one for today that I'm really excited to discuss with you guys. But as I endeavor upon pursuing knowledge and gaining life experience in this new phase of life through photography, fitness, podcasting, and much more, one habit that I've really formed is reading. So this podcast essentially goes through some of the books that I've been reading as of late, and taking some of those lessons learned and relating them to experiences in my life. But before going into that, let's go through today's story. And today's story is more comedic in nature, and essentially no lessons to be learned. But I always like sharing a lighthearted story before I go into the deeper content. So when I was in college, I used to take our Chicago subway system that is called the CTA, the Chicago Transit Authority, mainly the Red Line. And the red line is an interesting situation most times, as well as the blue line, because I believe those are the two lines that are um, in operation 24 hours a day. And you're bound to run into some interesting people on those trains because homeless people will often sleep there, or they're always doing some kind of mischief on one of those train lines. So one day I'm at the library in Lincoln Park, which is also in Chicago, and I'm ready to go back to my apartment. Right, I'm 2 stops away from Lincoln Park, and it's late, and I'm just ready to go home, knock out for the night. So I used to live near Wrigley Field, which is where the Chicago Cubs play, and so my stop was upcoming. Right, I was 2 stops away from Lincoln Park. I'm waiting at Lincoln Park for the red line to come, and the trains don't come as often at night, so I'm waiting there for 5, 10 minutes, and out of nowhere, this homeless guy, he comes up to me, and he appears to be homeless at least, and he's an African American guy, right? He's a black dude, so he comes up to me and he starts speaking in what I believe to be German, which was a total curveball for me, right? The guy is wearing like torn up jeans, his foot is coming out of his sneaker, his shirt is like only has one button done, and you can see his whole torso and everything like that. Just looking really ratchet, disheveled. So he comes up to me, starts speaking German, but what I can make out from it is Wrigley Field. So he's speaking German, but intermittently he's saying Wrigley Field. And so in my mind, I'm like, this guy, he's not being mean to me. And if he needs to know where Wrigley Field is, I can kind of, make hand gestures. I'm headed the same direction, so I can just say, hey, follow me to Wrigley Field. That's fine. We'll get there. So I'm trying to help this guy out. I'm really trying to figure out what he's saying and everything like that. And he keeps talking German, keeps speaking German to me. And we get on the train, and he keeps speaking German, and he keeps saying Wrigley Field, intermittently. So we get to the stop where Wrigley Field is, and I'm pointing to him like, Wrigley Field is right there. It's right there. You can see it. And then he goes, nah, I'm just fucking with you. And he's fluent in English. And I'm like, yo, dude, like that was a hard flex right there. You know what I mean? Like you kept up the German for about 20 minutes here. But I gotta give him his props that he committed to that whole situation, and we just sat there and laughed it off. Like he gave me a high five, and I went home and washed my hands thoroughly immediately. But it was a funny situation, so yep, I'll just leave it at that. So, um, moving on, right? So today we're going to be going through a new book. So we've just ended The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. Great book, but we're moving on to The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. I hope that's how you pronounce his last name. So, this book is also about being present, but it poses the situation differently. This is the first book that I've read in 2020 that lays everything out in a story format as opposed to like an open dialogue. So, going into the book itself, the main character is this boy named Santiago, and he's a sheep herder. Um, and the theme is laid out at the beginning that he's looking for some more fulfillment in his life. And we can all can relate to this. I personally can. Um, this whole thing that I'm doing right now is kind of about attaining more fulfillment in my life. And I could be wrong, but Santiago seems like he's a teenager or maybe in his early 20s, right? So he's a young guy. And so a couple of the things that he says in the beginning of the book that really laid the foundation for the rest of the book is that, so like I said, he's a sheep herder. So as he's walking through a field one day, he's nudging his sheep in the right direction, right? That's his job. And he says the only thing that concerns the sheep are food and water, right? And at baseline, all they're worried about is their survival, and they have no other problems but moving on to the next pasture to get more grass, more food, more water, right? More nourishment. He, he goes forward and says they were content with just food and water, and in exchange, they generously gave their wool, their company, and once in a while, their meat. So, going back to being content with just the survival mode. The sheep aren't worried about their bills. They aren't worried about, nuances at work. They're just worried about eating and drinking, which is simplicity. So, going forward, the author really sets the theme of this kid Santiago being uneasy with his surroundings, right? Needing a change. And I think we all have felt that at times. Sometimes I feel that every couple years I feel like I need a new job. I need to shake things up. I need to go against the grain a little bit, or I need to just um, have a new environment, have a new atmosphere. So I totally feel what Santiago is feeling right now, even though this book kind of takes place what it seems like centuries ago. So one thing that Santiago is always wondering is is that there's something else out there. There's something else that the world has to offer. And it was much more important, and the author says, right? It was much more important for him to see the world as opposed to finding God. So whatever that means, right? To him, he was much more interested in seeing the world. And I think some of us have that wanderlust, travel, I can't sit still, type itch, right? And I think that it's important to explore that as well, right? When things are when you are a little uneasy, when you are ready for that next step, explore it fully. But I don't want to go too deep into that right now. I just want to lay the foundation for everything. So um, going back to what he said, he doesn't, he's more interested in exploring the world than finding God. And this resonates with me mainly because I think that many people do associate finding fulfillment with finding God. And that, that's good, right? That is a commendable effort. But I don't think it's the one for me, right? I don't necessarily associate fulfillment with finding God. But that's just me, right? So we'll move on from that. So Santiago, his whole reasoning for becoming a sheep herder was to see the world, right? So they go back to this point where Santiago's talking with his father, and he's telling his father that he wants to become a sheep herder. And he notices that in his father's eyes, his father wishes he could join him or wishes he could do the same, but he couldn't because he had to provide for the rest of his family. And that's an interesting conundrum, right? And I think we see that a lot even in the present day, where oftentimes people have hopes, they have dreams, they have things that they hope one day they can attain or they can do, but because of something that is right at hand, they can't get to it. So, I don't want to go into like a corrective action plan on that one, but just putting that out there. So, another thing to note is that a lot of this book and the lessons learned really take place when Santiago is just sitting down somewhere, or he takes a second to look around, and then he clicks, right? A realization is made. I think that's also very important, right? It relates to all the books that I've been talking about, where if you just stop for a second and look around and take in your surroundings and observe, you can really, really find tranquility, peace, and ease of mind, honestly. So going forward, back to the story. So Santiago's with his sheep one day, and um, his dad says before he sets off, it's the possibility of having a dream come true that makes life interesting. And so I want everyone to think about what's your dream that if came true, you would be fulfilled in life, right? Or what is that dream that you're chasing in life? And I think it's good that we put some kind of structure around it, not necessarily have to put an exact definitive goal, but it's good that we work towards something, I think, right? It gives us a purpose in life. So, we all have hopes. One day I'll get to retire early, one day I'll get to travel, I'll become famous. It's these types of hopes that make life interesting, right? That we can work towards. So, Santiago, he goes forward and makes a statement about meeting people and the folks that he would interact with on a day to day in the city that he's in. And it's a city like Andalusia or something like that, right? Um, so he says, right, when someone sees the same people every day, they wind up becoming a part of that person's life, right? And that's common sense. That makes sense. Um, they want the person to change. And if someone isn't what others want them to be, they become angry. And so everyone seems to have a clear idea of how others should be living their lives, but none about his or own. So that's a very powerful statement, I think, right? And it really does relate back to, the power of now, the four agreements. Um, Essentially, because we tend to want the best, right, for the people we care about the most. But how do we know what's best, right? Who are we to say what's best? Um, so I think I personally have a tendency to do this, or I did, right, in conversation. Um, I can I can possibly find myself constantly talking in advice, right, giving someone a solution or something like that. And I do this every day, so you should do it, right? And here's why you should, right, why you should do that. So it's a great example, I think, of the funneling, right, and the triaging of advice and data that we receive and that we should be doing, right? Is the person that's giving you advice someone who is living that advice? Is that person a credible source, right? There'll be times where let's talk about a fitness example, right? There'll be sometimes someone who's giving me fitness advice that is honestly obese, right? They don't have the body that I'm looking to attain, right? So if I'm looking to have a body that, if I'm looking to be ripped up, have those muscle cuts, put on some mass, I'm not going to go to someone who is let's not use the obese example. I'm not going to go to someone who is very scrawny. I'm not going to go to the marathon runner, right? I'm going to go to someone who has the body that I want, and I'm going to ask them how they got there, right? Um, but one clear example, even going forward, that I can use is a religious institution that I personally used to be a part of, right? Um, and it's interesting. When I was younger, right, I think especially with the South Asian community, Indian people, we were part of some religious organization, whether it's a Hindu organization, Muslim, you know, what do you call Christian, Catholic, any of these faiths, right? A lot of times we have grown up in a religious setting, um, and I think so. One thing in my circumstance, right? I think one thing that was preached was like the Bhagavad Gita 101, right? And that is like the Hindu Bible, if you can call it that, right? So a couple things, right? A few basic teachings are not to have expectations of others, right? That's 101. Expectations set you up for failure. We go forward into purity of mind, body, and soul, basic level principles in the Gita, right? We talk about karma yoga. We talked about in the last podcast, not being concerned with the fruits of your labor. So once I got older and I started having a firmer grasp of what these things meant, I realized that there were so many hypocrites around me, right? And that really didn't jive with me. There was a lot of aunties who they had a lot of expectations, right? And when their children didn't fulfill that expectations, they would be mad at their kids. They would shun their kids. There's a lot of egotistic interactions that would occur in this religious institution that I was part of, and it just didn't jive with me. When I took a second to look around, it didn't make sense for me to be there anymore. And I'm not saying it's bad. It just didn't really make sense for me to be there because I think what I always grew up, and I love the Gita because it's very welcoming. It's a book that is unlike any other. But it's a timeless book. Its teachings and things like that echo through the centuries, and I think they still apply to the day to today, right? Surrendering to the moment, accepting what is, things like that. Those still apply today. Those principles. And I was realizing that nobody around me was was living those principles, right? There was gossiping, there was rigidness, there was There's times where they're unwilling to discuss things that were relevant in today's society because of the stigma, things like drinking and whatnot. Those are things that that the Indian youth deal with, right? Um, Drinking is something that's not accepted in our culture, and it's hard for kids to talk about that with their parents, right? Not that it's something super important to talk about, but you know, in a youth group, if I were to bring up something like that and say, hey, look, it's okay if you guys do that, right? I'm not saying go do it, but it's okay if you do. Just make sure you're smart about it, right? But those things are common sense, but were frowned upon as I discussed them. So it didn't jive with me, right? Long story short. So I'm gonna come back to the book here, right? So I think, like I said, we need to be careful with the advice that we take, and who we take it from. So going forward, Santiago meets this old man, who claims to be the king of Salem, right? And I don't know where Salem is, but he claims to be the king of Salem. And so they're just chatting on a bench, and this old man is starting to probe Santiago for some deeper questions or some deeper thoughts. And Santiago's getting weary of this guy and thinks he's going to scam him. So as they get into deeper conversation, one question that Santiago asked the old man is, "What is the world's greatest lie?" Um, and that's a really deep question to ask, to be honest. And there was some back talk or some small talk before this happened, but I think this is the most important part. So, what is the world's greatest lie? And the old man answers, it's this: that at a certain point in our lives, we have lost control of what is happening to us, and our lives become controlled by fate. This is the world's biggest lie. That is a very powerful statement, because I think sometimes we have a tendency to say, when things are going wrong, when we experience a failure, that we just leave it all up. We just leave it all up to God, or we leave it all up to fate, just to get ourselves out of that equation. But I think the idea of leaving something up to a higher power is almost a cop out. And that's just me, right? Um, this doesn't alleviate us of trying our best at all times, right? So I think that if you try your best at all times, that's all you can do, and then the rest is out of your hands, truly, right? But it is only after you have tried your absolute best. So I'm not saying this thought is wrong, right? But I think we are in control of our universe. I think everything that we experience, we are in full control of, whether we want to believe it or not. So, like I said, all we can do is do our best and not worry about the end results. So, so this old man, like I said, he claims to be the king of Salem. And obviously, Santiago does not believe him at first, but he starts to say some wise things, and Santiago starts to become more curious about this old man. So, one thing that the old man mentions is that everyone has their own personal legend. And um, what that means is that everyone has their own story, right? What they dreamt of when they were younger. So I want you all to think about, when you were younger, what did you dream about becoming, right? Because at that point in your life, you weren't afraid to dream. You weren't afraid to yearn for everything that you like to see happen, right? But as time passes, there's this like mysterious force that will begin to convince you that it's kind of impossible to be that, right? So I'll say, when I was younger, I I wanted to be a radiologist. I don't know why. I don't even think I knew what a radiologist was. So I wanted to be a radiologist, and I would tell my mom that, I would tell people that. And I don't know if it was what I really wanted to be, but as I got older, I realized, the schooling that I have to do, just to get there and things like that. And then I started convincing myself, like, hey, look, you don't want to do that, right? And like I said, if I really wanted to do it, maybe I would have done it. But I started to convince myself that there was another route, right? There's a more practical route. Go to business school, get a business degree, get an accounting job, things like that. Becoming more quote unquote practical, as opposed to like high reaching. So anyway, um, the old man points at a baker, right? And he says when he was younger, the baker had a desire to travel as well, but he decided to open up the bakery to set some money aside so that he could travel one day. Okay, so just food for thought. I'm not going to dive into that one. So Santiago then starts to bargain with this old man, because the old man promises him, a map to this treasure, in the pyramids, right, in Egypt, and that's far away from where Santiago is. So Santiago has to make a choice now. Does he embark on this journey to the pyramids to find his treasure and remove himself from what he's familiar with, and then or does he potentially achieve his personal legend, right? Food for thought. Or does he stay comfortable with where he is? So I talk about this. I've talked about this before, but there's an interesting conundrum between seeking comfort and moving to the next level. And I find that sometimes, right? Like I've been at my job for a couple of years now. I think I'm ready for the next gig. I'm ready for the next I'm ready for a promotion. I'm ready for more responsibility. But at the same time, I have a great job right now. I'm very fortunate, especially in this climate, to have the job that I do have. But what balance do I strike between being comfortable with where I'm at, looking around, being grateful, but also moving forward to the next step in life? Um, because and he says this, the old man, because when each day is the same, we tend to forget how blessed we are. Extremely powerful. And I think it's always important to force yourself to say nice things about your situation, right? Say nice things about your spouse, say nice things about your job, say nice things about your car, say nice things about your friends, because you are lucky to be where you are right now. And I think often we might forget that notion, given all the the day-to-day issues that we face. So the old man goes forward and tells the boy, right, tells Santiago to do what I believe is a strange exercise, which I probably wouldn't have done if this old man told me to do it. So he tells Santiago to walk around the entire city, but he also gives him a spoon with a couple drops of olive oil on it, and he tells Santiago to carry that with him as he walks around the city. And this is a bogus ass situation, to be honest, because I would have been like, dude, are you Morpheus? Like, am I in the Matrix? Like, what am I doing? Just tell me the lesson here. Um, but whatever, right? So Santiago comes back after hours, and he says he couldn't look at anything because he was so focused on the spoon. And the old man says, the key to happiness is to experience all the marvels of the world while not spilling the 2 drops of oil. Super powerful. So what I take it as, don't resist the urge to experience the world, but maintain your presence and be here now. Don't get swept up by these marvels, right? Always be present in the moment, but push forward and explore. Moving on, right? So Santiago ends up believing this king, and so Santiago sells a couple of his sheep, and he's now on his way to the pyramids where he's going to find his quote unquote final treasure. Um, and that to him is achieving his personal legend. So he makes a stop in what I believe to be Africa, at a port where there's a market, and um, there's indications in the book that this is more of an Arabic setting. So just to paint the picture, it's probably more of a bazaar than anything. So some travel guides who turn out to be like scammers tell Santiago that if he gives them some money, that they'll get him to the pyramids. And obviously they scam him. And as they make their way through this chaotic bazaar, Santiago loses them. So now, going over the facts, Santiago is alone in a new country where he can't speak the language, and he says this: "I'm going to become bitter and distrustful of people who because one person betrayed me." Let me rephrase that or restart that. "I'm going to become bitter and distrustful of people because one person betrayed me. I'm going to hate those who have found their treasure because I haven't found mine." This is a great example of how we can either become resilient when we get knocked down, or we can stay down there, right? So you'll find Santiago Santiago turns this into a positive, but often people can let their failures really, really damper their scope on life, right? They can turn their once positive scope into a very negative perspective, and they honestly will be unhappy when others are achieving the success because they haven't achieved theirs. And that's selfish, right? We don't want to become these bitter, salty people just because our life is hard, right? And like I said, we're in control of our lives, and we can be successful in our own regard. So anyway, um, so I'll use I'll use a story of when I left Deloitte, right? So that was my first job coming out of undergrad, my first like big boy job, and I was new in my career, and I worked really hard. Um, and Honestly, when I left there, I was still very grateful for all the connections that I made, and everything that I've learned, technically. But I had mentors at Deloitte as well that saw me through my time there. And when I put in my 2 weeks, they all ghosted me. They all stopped talking to me. They were nowhere to be found. They wouldn't make time for me. They honestly acted like they didn't know me when I'd see them. And that was a really sad experience for me being new to the corporate world. I know, like, there's not quote unquote friends in the workplace and things like that, but it hit me pretty hard at the time because I've been interning with Deloitte for years, and I had these same mentors for years. And at the drop of a hat, they acted like they didn't know me. So I could have let that interaction really tamper my hopes and dreams for my career, and really lead me to distrust people, right? And not seek out mentors and people who are excellent in their own fields. But I figured out that a firm is a firm, right? Their allegiance isn't always to their employees. And so once you accept a truth, it's really on you to either move forward or dwell in that moment. So we really have to be weary of how we react to failure. Do we harbor resentment or do we push on? And Santiago really echoes that thought. He says, do I push myself as the victim, or do I think of myself as the adventurer in quest of his treasure? Two very different perspectives there. So Santiago immediately makes a decision in his mind, right? So he says, I'm going to go with the idea of being an adventurer in search of my treasure, right? In search of his personal legend. So instead of being like saddened by that whole situation, he starts to look at life glass half full. And this is the last part of the book that I'm going to mention today, because in the next podcast you're going to see how Santiago's positive attitude alone really brings him good omens. And one lesson that I learned from this book is to always follow good omens. So I think in terms of good omens, they can come in many forms: people, events, things like that. So I'm gonna use this example um, of I worked in a hospital system here in Chicago, and it was my first time. I had moved out of the house. I really wasn't like talking to my parents too much, and I was living alone in a one bedroom apartment, super like straight up bachelor pad, nothing in there, and it was like my first time really being on my own without roommates or anything like that, and it was an interesting time in my life. So, as I was working as a supply chain analyst, and I met this old lady, this old Indian lady, at work, and she was 70 years old, but she was so smart, so technically proficient. She was so good with Excel formulas, logic, SQL, Oracle, PeopleSoft. She knew everything about data, and it was so surprising to me because my grandmother is around 75, I'd say, and she is the total opposite. Like, she wouldn't know what a computer is, I think. So, she is street smart, but way different. Like, she could not hold a corporate job, and it was just so interesting to me because as I got closer to this lady at work, we sat right next to each other. As I got closer to her, she started sharing her stories with me. Um, Essentially, she came to this country about 40 years ago, and her husband did not come with her. Her husband divorced her. So she came to this country by herself with her son, and her son doesn't really talk to her either. So she lives alone as a 70-year-old lady, and she makes it work. She goes grocery shopping by herself. She pays her own bills. She has her own place that is her own. She's bought it, and she's just such a self-sufficient lady. And I really really respect her, and we still have a good relationship to this day. But throughout all of this, right, through all her hardship, she could have let all of that affect her, right? She could have let herself become this bitter old woman, but somehow she's always smiling, she's always giggling, she's laughing, and all of it. She was kind to me, and to me that was a good omen, right? She's a good omen, and she knew that I lived alone, and she would see my sad lunch that I would bring every day, which was it consisted of two veggie patties and two Greek yogurts, and that's it. I would eat that every day for 2 years. So what she would do is she would bring in dosa, she would bring in idli, she'd bring in all this other Indian food that she would cook. She would say, "Oh, I made it for me. I made extra." And as we would sit together in the cafeteria, she would just let me pick off her plate, and she would, if not, she would put things on my plate. She would warm up food for me. She would say, "I'm gonna go to the kitchen and warm up our lunch. Just meet me in there in a couple of minutes." And this lady, right? She's 70 years old, and she's by herself, but she's cooking at home. And I think, to be honest, it gave her something to look forward to, right? I think in a way, she looks at me as kind of like a son or a grandson. And moms really lean on cooking as their way of showing love. And I'll accept it. Her food's delicious. And I'm a growing boy, so I'm gonna definitely eat it all up. Um, but you know, her being an old lady, she was she made me want to always be on my best behavior, right? In a lot of cultures, but Indian cultures especially, we really place heavy emphasis on respecting our elders. So I always had that respect for her, but I wanted her to feel as if I was someone she could be proud of, right? And I don't know why that is, but she showed me like what a tough life really is, and how one can still be resilient and establish themselves, be a great grandmother, and not really harbor any resentment about her divorce. And she was easily one of the smartest people I have ever met. So I'm gonna leave you guys with that today. Um, and like I said, always follow good omens, right? If you even have an inkling that something is positive, that an activity is positive, that person is positive, follow that. Always follow the good omens. But that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys enjoyed. Feel free to leave me any feedback, and remember, only positivity. Thanks, guys.